Good morning. I'm Joe Weirix. I'm the Public Diplomacy Fellow at the George Washington Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. And on behalf of the Institute, on behalf of GW's School of Media and Public Affairs, welcome to this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars based on the Handbook of Public Diplomacy, edited and brought together by Sean Aday. Sean will be introducing our panelists for the day. He's associate professor here at GW's School of Media and Public Affairs, also a former director at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. So Sean will be emceeing the day and introducing our panelists. Hear from me a little later because those who have dialed in, if you've got questions, I'll be reading those out when we get to the Q&A session later in the hour. But with that, over to you, Sean. Thanks.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Joe, and really happy to be joined today by two old friends, Katherine Brown and James Pamment. The book that Joe's talking about is this one, the Handbook on Public Diplomacy that just came out from Elgar. I edited it, but it's got contributions from the leading scholars in the field and some practitioners, or in the case of Katherine, people who have been doing both, and even James. So we have a lot of different perspectives on public diplomacy here. The idea of the handbook is really to present sort of an opportunity for people doing research in this area or want to know more about it, about theory and practice, about what we know about public diplomacy, but also with an eye towards contemporary research, contemporary understandings, and looking forward. So it's ideally a kind of handbook that will have a longer shelf life maybe than some reference books. So we're really excited about it. And two of the best chapters in the book are by our guests today, Katherine Brown and James Pamment. So what's going to happen today is each of them is going to talk for a few minutes about the chapter they wrote. We'll have a little bit of a conversation amongst the three of us. And then while that's happening, any questions that you have, as Joe said, put them in the chat. And then he will basically moderate that part of the conversation. We'll go till a little before 11 DC time. All right, so let's get started here. So first of all, I'm going to turn it to Katherine. Dr. Katherine Brown is an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program. She was an aide in the public affairs section at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul from 2003 to 2004, and went on to spend years in Afghanistan conducting research on the interplay of the U.S. and Afghan news media narratives and diplomacy from 2009 to 2016. Resulting in her PhD in communications from Columbia University in 2013. And her book, Your Country, Our War, The Press and Diplomacy in Afghanistan, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Katherine, thanks for joining us. Great to see you again. You want to tell us a little bit about what you wrote about?
Thank you so much, Sean, and great to be here with you and James, and to see so many friends tuning in. And thanks for having me. It was really a gift to be able to ask to write this chapter. So thank you, Sean, and congratulations. And a real massive contribution to the field in this handbook. And how many chapters are in it again?
Oh boy, like 35 or something like that.
35 chapters. Well, congratulations to you on editing such a important, consequential volume. So I'm excited to use it to help teach my course, and I know it'll be a resource to all of us in the academic and larger practitioner field of public diplomacy. So so I got an opportunity to talk about and reflect on 20 years of public diplomacy in Afghanistan. As Sean said, I really started my career in public diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul 22 years ago. And while I wasn't in the public diplomacy field those entire 20 years, and in no ways is this an exhaustive review of those years, I was there doing my PhD research and was in and out for about 13 years on the news media, which was a big part of the public diplomacy efforts, both the US news media, so the public affairs dimension of it, but then also the development of the Afghan news media, which was a big part of the reconstruction effort in the country. So it's a personal chapter for me to write, and I thought it would be important to start with why public diplomacy is matters for national security in any country. It adds, a set of tools for diplomacy and for defense. It supports building alliances and trust to advance foreign policy objectives. It helps a nation's ability to influence globally and advance cooperation between peoples. And by doing so, it helps prevent crisis and conflict. And it also helps to protect economic interests. So it's first and foremost a toolkit for diplomats and officials to engage publics to advance their goals. And public diplomacy in a crisis or in a conflict kind of takes on a new meaning with a specialized toolkit. And that's what this chapter gave me an opportunity to reflect on. So we look at 20 years and what we can begin to learn from it. Public diplomacy was in one way, a small dimension of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan for those 20 years. It included counterterrorism and nation building objectives. So that mission, included counterterrorism and nation building objectives, supporting Afghanistan's economy, its military, its police, its government infrastructure, its civil society. That U.S. mission in total cost, according to the Special Investigative Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, cost $837 billion in combat fighting and $145 billion in reconstruction aid. And public diplomacy was a small part of that, of that overall cost. But because it was so central to the US mission, it's really important that we not look at public diplomacy in a vacuum for those 20 years. You have to think about its failures and its successes as being part of those of the entire US mission. But what's really, I think, critical to understanding this too is that influencing the Afghan people were always at the center of the US mission. The effort to, quote, win hearts and minds of the Afghan people, or to gain their emotional and their intellectual support for the US mission and the democratic government of Afghanistan, was just central to all military diplomacy and development efforts. So it was this core dimension of a frequently changing security framework to gain the Afghan people's emotional and intellectual support for both the US mission and the alliance, and also for the development of an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So I look at this from three different chapters, three different sections, sorry. And what's, I think, really important to also point out is that there was a history of US public diplomacy in Afghanistan before 9/11. In the 1960s and 70s, the US supported international exchange and cultural programs, participating in Afghan exposition events, seeing them as a really important platform for the United States to illustrate its technological advancement during the Cold War. So there was a muscle memory, there was a history to really build from, starting back in 2001. And so from there's 2001 and 2008. These were the Bush administration years. This was the time that there was a belief, really that we needed to have this mission in Afghanistan, in part driven by vengeance of 9/11, but also this belief that supporting the Afghan people, especially women, was a moral imperative. And so that need for that connection with the Afghan people was very strong in the early years, and those were the years in which I served. So there was the return of traditional US public diplomacy programs for Afghans, like exchange programs, the beginning of reconstruction efforts with the news media and education institutions and other civil society institutions. And there was the bringing back of, or the introduction of American spaces, or they're called like Lincoln Corners, I believe, in institutions like libraries and schools across the country. The International Visitor Leadership Program came back, the Fulbright program came back, the YES program was introduced as part of the Kerry Lugar Initiative. And in 2022, you had the provincial reconstruction teams, which were established to support the civilian military's missions, nation building activities. And PRTs were often thought to be on the front line of winning hearts and minds, the battle to win hearts and minds in Afghanistan. And it was a place where you could launch different efforts to connect with the Afghan people. So public diplomacy efforts really quickly became intertangled with active combat efforts, while simultaneously supporting global counterterrorism strategies in that first kind of 8 years. And then you had the section goes on to talk about the Obama years, 2009 to 2016. And this was at a time when security began to deteriorate in the country. And President Obama and his administration adopted this population-centric or counterinsurgency, or what's called COIN strategy. And that had become quite popular. In around 2006, it was added into the handbook. I'm forgetting the exact name, the field guide,
Field manual. Yeah.
field manual. Thank you.
Yeah.
For for our service members. And very quickly, public diplomacy became absorbed by this larger security framework. And it became flooded with funding that supported larger scale reconstruction efforts. And so during these COIN years, the US military launched Hearts and Mind campaigns across the country. And with COIN, US troops had to be many different things. They had to be warriors, but also social workers and engineers and builders and educators, mediators, really whatever the Afghan civilians needed in that whatever district they were in. This was a really fascinating time. This was a time that I think Sean and I both spent a couple of months at the COIN Academy in Kabul, doing our own research. And what you really saw was that public diplomacy, just took on such a large scale presence, but not just coordinated, by the State Department, but coordinated by the military. There was an even sharper focus on reconstruction. And it was just really seen as being critical in extending civilian military power. And so around this time too, because of the large scale funding that was going into this work, there was this outsized dependence on contractors, and there was increased violence, and really something I talk a lot about in my book, which is frustration over these like parallel structures of governance, that President Karzai at the time saw. So COIN was beginning to kind of inadvertently undermine this credibility with the Afghan people that it was meant to establish, and starting to really complicate public diplomacy efforts in the country. So as we get to kind of the final years of Trump administration and the Biden administration, really the U.S. mission continued to operate this very large scale public diplomacy operation. I think in the last year, it was distributing like $197 million in awards to support civil society and free media, counterterrorism efforts, build professional educational and cultural ties between Afghanistan and the United States. But with the security condition worsening, really, there was less of an appetite, obviously, to continue the mission, and it ended. And public diplomacy efforts really ended in mid-sentence. They were still ongoing at the time. So to close here, I think to kind of the chapter, I try to talk about what we have begun to learn, but also what some of the successes are. Because I think when people think about Afghanistan, they see failure, they see a strategic failure. And again, public diplomacy cannot be judged, it's in a vacuum. It needs to be looked at within the realm of policy and decisions that were made around diplomacy and defense and development at the time. And what I really, really believed as a practitioner there, but also now kind of as a part-time academic and looking back, is that within this chaotic theater of conflict, really, it was very difficult to seek credibility and a deep level of engagement with the Afghan people, really due to two key kind of bureaucratic constraints and security constraints. The security situation was very intense, and not in the beginning, but as time went on. And also so that really shielded people from engaging, US officials and other Western officials from engaging with the Afghan people. But there was also a short-term nature of US officials' assignments in the country. And that really created this cycle that there was a constant state of like relationship building and kind of starting over. And it was difficult to really build on like key gains and wins with the short-term nature of assignments. At the same time, there was a remarkable successes still. US public diplomacy efforts contributed to a really multifaceted Afghan civil society um, and support for democracy. Afghanistan's independent press was one of the top two trusted institutions in the country. The communications infrastructure supported the majority of Afghans to stay connected and create mobile solutions to business and media and governance. More than 86% of the public supported women's education and higher education institutions increased. And so there's much more to this, but there really was a burgeoning civil society that was aided by public diplomacy efforts and reconstruction efforts. And there was also an incredibly strong relationships that were built with the Afghan people through exchanges, through educational, cultural, and professional exchange programs. U.S. officials, soldiers, Marines, journalists, aid workers also built really strong organic relationships with the Afghan people. And this really came to light during the extraordinary private efforts to evacuate and resettle and support the Afghan people after the evacuation in 2021. But I'll kind of end by talking about the lessons here. I think the first thing is I know a journalist that I know and a filmmaker, an Afghan journalist that I know, wrote something that really stuck with me, which is that his name's Bakhtash Adi, and he wrote that Americans went straight to building roads, schools, and governing institutions in an effort to win hearts and minds without first figuring out what values animate those hearts and what ideas fill those minds. And that really goes back to kind of the first lesson about listening. And this is what Nick Call really emphasizes in his work, and so many of you do as well. We need to prioritize listening to the people we're trying to influence. That's really critical. It's an essential dimension of public diplomacy efforts, and it affords us a better ability to understand the public and what they want and how to connect and redirect policy and communication. That's really hard to do in a conflict environment. It requires, a different approach. And second of all, the coordination between the interagency is really critical. And this is something where I think we have a lot more lessons, to be reflecting on. Listening and relationship building is important for us with the local public, but also between, in the US government at least, Department of State and the US military. The lines between public diplomacy and traditional diplomacy have blurred. And this is what Bruce Gregory says. The core goal of public diplomacy is indistinguishable from US foreign policy objectives, of promoting and defending the free flow of goods, ideas, and people. So there needs to be greater coordination back in the conflict theater between these two entities. And then third, we have a lot to rethink about strategic communications and campaigns and other in-country public outreach activities. At the same time, there is this timeless nature of our exchange programs. And what we saw was the ability to really build relationships when you remove people from the conflict environment. Security provides oxygen, and people-to-people exchange programs were arguably the best tool to build that trust and understanding with the Afghan people through 2 decades. So managing these programs can feel really chaotic and challenging in conflict. But at the same time, they create that space to create critical pathways for better listening and understanding. And so there's a lot more, and I know I probably went on a little too long there, Sean, but there's a lot more to
That's all
think
right.
about these 20 years. But that's kind of my first attempt to think about what these key lessons are.
Great. Thank you very much. Actually, very efficient way to wrap up 20 years of public diplomacy in Afghanistan, which is worth about 400 books and dissertations. All right. Dr. James Pamment is the director of Lund University Psychological Defense Research Institute and an associate professor of strategic communication at Lund University. He has served as editor-in-chief of the journal Place Branding and Public Diplomacy and is one of the leading scholars on public diplomacy and national security. James, why don't you tell us about your chapter that you wrote with a couple of great colleagues, Martina Smedberg and Elsa Isaacson.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should begin by saying I have a sore throat. I've just been ill. I actually caught it in the US traveling home. And so I hope you can hear me okay, and I hope my voice lasts for the whole 10-minute talk. Let me also say the chapter was co-written by two of my PhD students, two really great colleagues. And the chapter is actually sort of the opposite of Catherine's. I mean, Catherine just gave an incredible. So we haven't read each other's chapters. We haven't had the chance to see the book yet, and that was just an incredibly, rich story that deserves to be retold and reanalyzed. Um, what we're trying to do in this chapter is really sort of at the opposite end, remove a lot of the detail and try and think a bit more conceptually, and kind of make some kind of quite sweeping um, conclusions about history. So it's in many ways the opposite, but I think some of the things Catherine talked about are definitely included in parts of this story that I'm about to tell. Um, and so what we wanted to do in this chapter is really two things. The first is to draw together the role of public diplomacy in national security. And for that, we talked in very general terms across three eras, the sort of post-war period or Cold War period, um, the period after 9/11, and then the period after 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and how those different security contexts change public diplomacy's role. And then what we do in the second part is, again, Nick Cole gets a name check, but his concept of reputational security we use as kind of a launching point to discuss, firstly, what type of security are we talking about in the current era, or I should say the pre-2025 era. It feels like everything's changed in the last couple of months, but what types of security are we really talking about? What types of public diplomacy, what function should they have to support that? So that's kind of the aim of the chapter. In terms of the first part, then, in looking at the three different eras, I mean, the first era, obviously, the Cold War period, um, it's pretty straightforward to draw an image of public diplomacy as supporting national projection, projection of values, a state-centric practice, one where there's this idea of competition of ideologies, so between democracy and capitalism against fascism and communism, for example, and the idea of kind of narrative and image being bound to the nation state. So the types of public diplomacy then during the Cold War era has been researched in great detail. State-initiated media, cultural promotion, exchange programs, with the idea of influencing public opinion and changing ideologies. Then we sort of fast forward to the post 9/11 era, where obviously violent extremism becomes a kind of key issue. The ideology is much more around dealing with extremism, the war on terror, and developing a new public diplomacy that was seen as fit for purpose. So for some people, that was more of a public relations type of public diplomacy. For others, something that involves more non-state actors, a bit more of a dynamic interaction with target audiences, and many of the forms that Katherine was talking about in parts of her talk with regards to Afghanistan. But also, I think this was the era when the idea, Simon and Holt floated the idea that public opinion is the new superpower. That kind of idea that the image really means everything, and if we aren't managing our images, then we're mismanaging the state in some way. And then the final era that we discussed really goes from the annexation of Crimea through to the pandemic. And this era can be kind of characterized by the rise of authoritarianism, sort of decline of the optimism, the growing sort of progressive period that we saw from the early 90s onto kind of mid-teens, if you like, where by the start of the pandemic, democratic values had declined in 70% of countries around the world. So a retreat of internationalism, surge of populism, Brexit, the first rise of Trump, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro, a kind of new, liberal democracy being brought under threat. And so in conjunction with this is obviously a rise of digital media, a kind of change in how we consume news, change in how we relate to each other across borders due to social media. And it's a kind of era of, maybe it's an overused term, but kind of gray zone. So hybrid threats, non-declared wars, the ambiguity between peacetime and wartime, acts that fall below the threshold of conventional war, and seeing this kind of gradually shape the global context until 2022. And during that time, then we see public diplomacy really change in some key organizations. So, for example, the European External Action Service's Strategic Communication Division basically turned into a counter-disinformation unit from 2015. The NATO Public Diplomacy Division is increasingly tying up its resources in dealing with disinformation. The Global Engagement Center obviously became bigger before it disappeared, but also public diplomacy bureaus such as ECA started getting additional programming resources for countering state-sponsored disinformation. So there's definitely a move in this direction where public diplomacy started to kind of glide into actually meaning counter-disinformation. So those three eras give quite different views of what national security should be, but also quite different views of public diplomacy's role in that. What we then do in the second part of the chapter is look at reputational security and take basically 5 aspects of it that Nick Cole describes, and we start to explore like what does this mean in practice? And as an example, we draw upon the new Psychological Defense Agency, which some of you may be aware of, that was created in Sweden in 2022. It opened its doors in January. It was quite good timing. And with that comes, certainly in the Swedish context, a new concept of what security means, but also how the country deals with some public diplomacy related issues. And Nick talks about, and again, it really links very well to what Katherine said in her conclusions. The first thing that he says that is really key to reputational security is listening. And we think, or we contend in the chapter that yes, listening, there's a lot of talk about listening, but actually in the current post kind of 2014 phase, if you like, listening increasingly means situational awareness, which is not really the same thing that I think Nick meant when he wrote this. So situational awareness in terms of understanding threat actors, mapping the information environment, and trying to understand the nature of information threats. That's increasingly when NATO PDD or the European External Action Service talks about listening, that's really what they mean. The second is building and defending a reputation. In many respects now, this is increasingly a reputation that we are capable of being resilient to external threats. So the reputation that we're trying to build is of a country, don't try and mess with our elections. Don't try and influence our populations. They're resilient, they're educated, they know how to get factual information. The third is efforts to undermine reputations of adversaries. So Nick says that this is kind of a key aspect of reputational security. This is also something that many countries now do as part of their counter-disinformation work. They tend to call it counter-branding. It's where you try and rebrand threat actors into what you see them as rather than let them tell their own story. So you tell the story of the threat actor. So for example, counter-branding Russia is to not let them tell their story, but to explain the history of their aggression in Ukraine, for example. The fourth that Nick describes is reforms to align a state with the values of foreign audiences. This is a tricky one. I think, in the past, it's often been seen that countries that are trying to develop a reputation want to show that they're aligned with the US, for example, in terms of their actions. In this one, we definitely see some communities of countries that want to share best practice in terms of building resilience and showing that they're kind of credible allies. But this is an area where I think maybe there's room to discuss a little bit more how this is beginning to take shape, because it seems to me that countries at the moment don't really care so much about how foreign audiences perceive them or what their values are. And then lastly, Cole says that reputational security derives from countries that take responsibility for the health of the information environment. And again, there's lots of countries who want to try and, particularly in Europe, who want to try and, for example, clean up social media. But what we're seeing, obviously, in the last couple of years is very strong resistance from the platforms, now backed up, obviously, by US policy. So definitely changes in that idea as well. So in sum, I think the chapter that we wrote, it already feels like it's a little bit outdated in terms of some of the things that are happening right now, but at the same time, we're raising some questions that were probably, pretty much on the nose for some of these issues. I think it leaves us with two kind of open questions. Number one, what type of security are we talking about when we talk about, the things that public diplomacy contributes to? The answer seems to be increasingly cognitive security. So the kind of psychological defense mechanisms, the cognitive defense mechanisms by which people are able to withstand information attacks from wherever that's coming from. Maybe some of these sources are domestic as well. And secondly, what types of public diplomacy does this create? What kind of function does public diplomacy have? That for me is a much more open question. I don't have a clear answer to that. I'm very interested to understand what's happening in the public diplomacy field in the US at the moment. But it seems to me in many of the other countries that I've been looking at, public diplomacy is becoming more securitized and is becoming much more about overtly countering disinformation or providing the countries that normally would be provided with other kinds of support, actually with support in developing media literacy and other elements that helps defend against disinformation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, James. That was terrific. All right, I have a zillion questions, but I want to maybe start by going back to Katherine for a second. And in your chapter and in what you said today, you talk about this, obviously this very long period. And one of the things that you point out in the chapter is this sort of bell curve of funding for public diplomacy and from the US perspective. And that, this was a place, Afghanistan, that had the largest public diplomacy budgets anywhere in the world from the US perspective. And I think that would be just generally. And yet at the end of the day, at the end of this period, you talk about some successes that we should look at, but also that overall the entire enterprise, whether it's not just public diplomacy, is complicated at best and had a lot of failures as well. So one of the questions I have for you is, could anything have been done differently on the public diplomacy end to improve the kind of goals that we're looking for there that any country would be? Or was this always going to be doomed by policy failure? Because this is always the tension with public diplomacy, particularly in a national security setting, is public diplomacy ideally gets you through, because it's long-term in focus, gets you through short-term policy disagreements with foreign publics, et cetera. But if overall the policy is a failure, particularly over a long period of time, do you really have a chance of getting past that? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that from the Afghanistan side.
It's a good question. it is hard to look back, on 20 years of painstaking work, that went into to the public diplomacy operation. And I think that when you do look back, you see I see more clearly now, like how could at a large scale this have worked well given the massive like military presence in the country and the coordination also with allied countries with the International Security Assistance Force as well. And that, ultimately whatever work that was done that I took part in too was going to get absorbed by this larger security framework. Um, so in that vein, it is very difficult to, if you don't look at you can't look at public diplomacy in a vacuum. Um, in the way that it's meant to serve policy and it's meant to support policy objectives. And so the challenge and the tension there, I see is that there was, and this is constantly what's playing out in the theater of Afghanistan, was that the short-term objectives, for security, for military gains, for things that would advance kind of overall the larger goals and objectives of the United States would undercut those longer term goals that we had in public diplomacy to build trust and credibility, and to build civil society and build the country, like reconstruct a democratic, society in partnership with the Afghan people. Like those longer term goals were often undercut by short term military efforts. And also the short termism of just how we operated in the country. Understandably, there was bureaucratic constraints. If you ask somebody to go and serve there in a high threat environment, it's, you say it's going to be a year, you give vacation, you give them things that they need to kind of get through that hardship. Um, that also unfortunately meant that we were kind of restarting constantly. And so the Afghan people would build trust maybe with some folks, and then their time would be up and new people would arrive. So there was a saying, I can't remember who to attribute it to, but that, we didn't fight a 20-year war. We fought a series of 1-year wars 20 times. We had so much cycling in and out. So that also kind of undercut the long-term objectives and goals of public diplomacy when you think about relationship building to advance foreign policy objectives, or in this case, military objectives as well. So was it doomed? I mean, I think, inevitably it's serving policy. So the policy decided to move on, then, public diplomacy did as well. But when I look at what actually the kind of some of the legacies and what succeeded, I think it's really important to point those out. Exchanges were a tremendous asset in building relationships, but also providing professional skills and support, to journalists, to educators, to nonprofit leaders, to businesses, to entrepreneurs, and getting them, those opportunities to really build a connection with one another as well, kind of through those exchanges and trainings. I think what is important moving forward is that we are very clear-eyed. We should ever be in this position again, about what a public diplomacy mission's limitations are, kind of in this kind of environment. And we should also be clear-eyed about what its potential successes could be, and kind of thinking about where do we want to pay our focus and understanding, and where we're in our resources, into public diplomacy. So its success was limited. To answer your question, it's public diplomacy is always going to be in service of the policy. So the policy moves on, PD needs to as well. But the long-term goals and successes of relationship building, there were limited successes there. And we should be clear-eyed about those limitations, but also those opportunities moving forward.
And James, the issue of timing comes up in the chapter that you did with your colleagues, particularly in this, current era, if you will, over the last 10 or 15 years, where you're talking about reputational security. This idea of having to take something like public diplomacy that by definition is normally thought of as a long-term strategic goal, or having long-term strategic goals about relationship building and that sort of thing. But having to do that in an environment where particularly your adversaries might be operating in much more immediate term. In Afghanistan or other coin environments, this was an issue where let's say there was a drone attack by an ally, whether it was the US or somebody else, and the classic wedding party sort of example. Well, the Taliban could get a lot of information, or Al Qaeda could get a lot of information out very quickly, and it wasn't necessarily true, but it was out there. And whereas a military was having to go through a lot of process, a lot of bureaucracy about its public affairs on how to deal with that. And so you're always sort of in this situation. And your chapter talks about that in the disinformation era as well. And you kind of are positing a public diplomacy that's reactive. And I'm curious how you think, which governments you think are maybe doing a better job of that, or are we just losing the long-term relationship building aspect of it because countries are having to spend so much time dealing with disinformation in the immediate term? Is there any way to combat that from a media literacy standpoint or something else?
I think there's kind of pushes in two directions. Like whenever public diplomacy and kind of countering disinformation end up in the same bucket, which maybe is a very bad idea. I'm not sure. We might look back on this period as just a big mistake and sort of go back to basics. But I think there's a tendency to view the long-term relationship building exchanges as almost ring-fenced. That exists, it will always exist, and it goes on in the background ticking over. And it isn't so politicized in many countries. Probably just to protect it, just so that it keeps going. And then you have the shorter term stuff, which is increasingly about getting the message across, getting our lines out there, correcting, debunking, pushing back on what Russians or Chinese or Iranians are saying. And I think that has become much more reactive. Often in these kinds of discussions, people will say, yeah, but what about our narratives? Why are we always countering someone else's narratives? What do we want to say about democracy or about our country? And the room usually goes quiet. And I think you're right in the sense that we've been caught in someone else's OODA loop, and we're just constantly responding to what they're pushing in our direction. But I do think generally the longer term stuff, at least in the countries I've been looking at, has been fairly well protected, but probably still in a general decline budget wise, just slowly over the years, a sort of attritional decline.
It seems like, one of the things that has served some countries better historically, and your chapter, has more of an even longer historical time frame than Katherine's, is the reputation of the source queue. So if your government, if your country doesn't have a lot of credibility in a certain part of the world or generally, then your messaging is going to be less effective as well. Historically, that's at least how we thought about it. Your chapter talks about the Cold War. Certainly that would be an example of it, or have several examples of it. In this case, I'm thinking, okay, so the Russians and the Chinese, you mentioned the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, in terms of disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Specifically, let's talk about the Russians. Very active all around the world, but especially in Europe and the United States. Is part of is one potential strength of public diplomacy that you can build your own brand, if you will, and brand is obviously a part of the public diplomacy discussion, while the Russians have less of a brand, or is the problem here, or a less credible brand, or is the problem here that because of what you describe about digital media, social media, other types of ways in which messaging is done in the current environment, disinformation especially, that we don't always know that source cue. And so how do you combat that? So if you tell me, oh, this message came from the Russians, I'm going to think about it differently than if I just see the message, right?
Yeah. That, it's a tricky one. I think, the way that Russians seem to be working at the moment is, their threat intelligence is much better than ours. They're listening, that if you want to call it that. They have a really good sense of what flies and what doesn't fly in a country, and they're monitoring social media, they're monitoring traditional media, and constantly looking for uh, attack vectors. Basically, that's even what they call them in some of their internal documents, and they'll say we're looking for attack vectors that help to achieve their goals. So, for example, if one of their goals is to get Zelensky out of office, they're constantly looking for attack vectors from media, from social media, as to what's happening today that we can, what conflicts are there, what issues are there that we can use to help support our goal. I don't think when we do our public diplomacy or our branding that we understand our own audiences that well, our own countries that well. If we're trying to defend them from this, if we're trying to build resilience to these kind of attacks, I don't think we're really quite there. Um, and some of it is like legal in nature, like we're not allowed to, GDPR kicks in for us when we're trying to understand our own population, and maybe we want to collect some accounts to start monitoring so that we can learn what people are saying in different communities. There's nothing hindering foreign countries who don't care about GDPR from doing that. But if we want to do that for our own populations to protect them, we get kind of bound up in legal issues. So there's those kind of questions. Um, and then, it's difficult with an adversary that doesn't really care about their brand. You know,
Right.
they're not necessarily trying to build anything, but they're trying to, I often think of Putin, instead of wanting to make the quality of life of the Russian people better, he wants to bring the quality of life down for everyone else in the world,
Yep.
so that it seems better in Russia. And it's, communicatively, it's the same thing. They're not trying to build a positive brand. They're just trying to ruin everybody else's
Exactly.
cohesion and trust. Um, there's no simple way of solving that.
It's like the anti-public diplomacy. Joe, do we have any questions from you or anybody else?
We do. We have some questions from attendees, and mindful of the time, let me bundle. I've got two, one each for Catherine and James. Let's start with those. Um, Catherine, to what extent did military practitioners in Afghanistan view their information operations as similar to or different from the public diplomacy of civilian practitioners?
That's a great question. So I have I have an anecdote here. I think that answers the question. When I served in the public affairs section, from 2003 to 2004, and then went back several years later for my PhD research and spent a lot of time talking to public diplomacy practitioners at the embassy, talking to folks doing counterinsurgency, within ISAF, and also doing military information, operations. And I remember going in to meet with I think it was like a PSYOPs advisor, and interviewing him for a paper, and was talking about my work with the Afghan journalists and really learning about the efforts to build up this independent news media culture in the country, which had been incredibly successful, wildly popular, the most trusted institution in the country. I think the last time there was a survey of the Afghan people, pre-2021, it was maybe the second most trusted, next to religion. And I met with this officer, and I was talking about the news media, the Afghan news media, and he said, "Oh, those guys are great." And then he's like, "Can you, he's like, one thing you should know, we pay those guys." to run stories. And it wasn't like the most popular news agency in the country, but it was one of them. And it just kind of hit me that this is probably the most emblematic of the short-termism versus the long-termism of the goals. That you had a military officer who was very focused on, a psyops effort and wanted to use this burgeoning local news media, that was a trusted purveyor of information in the country to advance a short-term goal when that had the risk of undermining the long-term objective of that institution continuing that credibility with the Afghan people in service to the efforts, to build a democratic society. So it was, I think, that tension between short-termism and long-termism and the lack of, coordination between those efforts. I don't know if that's something that's solvable. That's something I want to think a lot more about, but that was the best example of that.
James, I've got one for you, and then I've got another for the whole panel. So, James, as you look at historical patterns of PD practice, apart from differences in conceptual frame, tools, methods, do you see an episodic correlation between levels of government or citizen support for public diplomacy and perceptions of external threat?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose in general we talk about these areas, eras because they're categorized by a lot of new activities, new funding, new initiatives. So there probably is a correlation, and that's probably why they were chosen in the first place. But I think also, one of the areas that isn't discussed is the 90s, where there's a peace dividend of some sort, and the funding goes down, and less of a perception of a threat. So probably it holds pretty well, at least from a you know a very high level overview. Maybe if we go into it in a bit more detail, I don't know how well it correlates. Um, but I think one of the interesting things, though, and also building on what Catherine just said, is that there's perceptions of a threat and increased funding on communications, sometimes called public diplomacy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that funding actually goes to the core activities of public diplomacy, such as international broadcasting and exchanges. Maybe it goes to much more short-term things, such as buying influence, if you like, for immediate results, and perhaps that's one of the sort of things worth bearing in mind, that the increased funding doesn't necessarily go to the places where it probably should.
And Sean, if you'll indulge me, I think we have one more set of questions if we've
Yeah,
got
of
time.
course.
So last question is one about where we find ourselves right now in Washington. The question is just looking at the closure of the GEC, the ongoing closure of USAGM, and exchanges and grants on ICE. Um, the question asks if the panelists think the world is willing to be patient for the United States to reemerge from an era of isolationism. Um, and in a related vein, following up on James' comment from earlier, asking the question if the U.S. Is no longer uh, as supportive of countering disinformation on social media as some of our partners. Are there others willing to engage in public diplomacy to pick up that slack?
James, you want to take that as the sort of the outsiders from the US outsiders perspective?
Sure. Well, starting with the first question, I would say so. So I'll try and be optimistic, which I know may seem like a weird thing to do, but if we assume then that there's going to be lots of cuts, the GEC is already gone, USAGM, is obviously we don't know exactly what's happening, but it's in process at the moment. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America are probably gone within a month. Um, Other parts we don't know about, but I mean, it doesn't look good at the moment. The only optimistic spin I can give on it, I think it's going to be terrible for the next few years. But if I were a student now, a grad student now, or sort of earlier in my career, I would be thinking, well, okay, in 4 years' time, um, probably many of these institutions will need to be recreated. And the question is then, okay, and imagine if they don't exist, what should they look like? How would you build them for today? Um, and that could be a really stimulating and fantastic opportunity for some of the um, younger people or the ones coming through who have ideas about what these institutions should look like in the modern era. Um, so maybe there is room for a kind of heritage foundation project, but for public diplomacy, starting in 4 years' time. On the second question, I think European countries are really big on counter disinformation at the moment. There's the Digital Services Act. Musk has said that they're going to do everything they can within their power to stop it. So we'll probably see the threat of tariffs against having you know our own European rules against spreading disinformation on platforms. And it will then become a bit of a game of chicken as to who will kind of blink last. Hard to say at the moment, but the noises from the EU so far have been that they're not going to be dictated to, you know, with still sovereign countries who should get to decide their own laws. So we'll see, but potentially, the EU, European countries could pick up some of the slack for Radio Free Europe, for example, and some of the other. And certainly they are in Ukraine with some of the programs already. So not everything is just disappearing. There are some countries looking to pick up some of the slack.
Yeah, I think the issue there is, as James said, out of crisis opportunity, and I think there's a tendency to get U.S. centric in some of these conversations, particularly with Americans. But there's a chance here for others to pick up slack and for there to be reform and things like that. And also, it's early. There's a lot of road ahead here, so I think there's a lot of opportunity to just kind of see what happens. Okay, well, we are sort of at time. So first, I want to thank James and Katherine and for great chapters and presentations and discussion today. It's always great to see you guys. I want a little programming note. This is just the first of 4 of these webinars that we're doing with IPGC. So join us next Tuesday, March 25th at 11 a.m. Washington, D.C., New York time, when we'll be joined by 2 more authors from the Public Diplomacy Handbook, Alistair Muskimmin and Ben O'Loughlin, who will discuss the role of strategic narratives in public diplomacy, as well as AI and other contemporary issues in the field. Then on April 1st at 10 a.m., another one of our practitioner authors, former Senior Foreign Service Officer and former IPGC State Department Fellow Mark Taplin, who's also U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Paris, is going to join me to talk about the centrality of public diplomacy and foreign relations and current challenges. And then finally, I'll talk to American University professor Kendra Salois at 11 a.m. on April 22nd in the last of our webinar series about her chapter on hip hop, music, and cultural diplomacy. Thanks again to Joe and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication for hosting this. Its director, Babak Bahadur, and to Rocio and Dabani for all their help in putting this on. Thanks, guys. And thanks for everyone who participated and joined us today. So take care, and I'll see some of you next week, I hope. All right, bye-bye.